Slower, right?
Okay, thank you very much for those people that are joining, and maybe we'll have other participants coming online. We'll do a quick round table here, see if voices transmit or not. I'm Bill, and I'm be co-chairing this and giving the inaugural presentation for the machine learning interest group meeting. And Lisa is my co-lead partner in crime, and she's going to moderate the session.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Lisa Litz, Health Sciences and Center for Healthcare Innovation.
Alan Katz, the Manitoba Center for Health Policy.
Actions in the medical genetics.
Rob Belshire, I'm a statistician at the Center for Healthcare Innovation.
Vong Yang, also community care sciences.
I'm Siobhan, I'm doing my master's in computer engineering. Hi, I'm a prior MCHB.
Okay, come on, MCHB.
Randy Wald, MCHB.
Doug Kimmelman, Bill Leslie's crew, roving research scientist. How's that? Albrechtson, what is it, the Albrechtson?
Albrechtson, yes, man of many talents. And Carson?
Hi, it is Carson, professor in computer science, specializes in the areas of data mining and data science.
Excellent. And Mohammed, I see you just joined us. Maybe just say hello to the group.
Hello, everybody. Hi.
From Department of Statistics. So, as I said before, this is sort of inaugural presentation around the machine learning field, and I'm the sacrificial presenter. Happy to kick this off, and hopefully this will be the first of many regular meetings. Lisa and I are happy to coordinate this, but this is a process that we hope will attract other individuals, and the long range is to promote collaborations broadly within the university and outside of the university in the area of machine learning. And so to get this rolling, there are a number of individuals who have already signed on to the interest group to participate and hopefully present, and the idea is to alternate between Bannatyne and Fort Garry campus, so we get a broad representation of skills and interest. So this is going to be informal, and hopefully it will grow over time. So with that as an intro, I'm just going to kick off our experience, initial experience with machine learning in a problem domain that, as anybody that knows me knows is near and dear to my heart, osteoporosis. So I just have to see, what's your page? Okay, come on, let's activate this. Good. So my day job is as a physician. I do nuclear medicine work and lots of work in reporting bone density measurements, which are used to diagnose and treat osteoporosis. But my night job is as a clinical researcher, and it's with a particular interest in osteoporosis. And so we have, there's a long, complicated title here, Identification of Vertebral Fractures by CNNs, and my journey from skeptic to convert. And I'll walk you through some of that. And first I'll highlight, this is not my work, this is a work of many individuals. And so I list the original team member, but we're growing this team. And Mohammed is on the call, and Doug Kimmelman is here as well, but there are other individuals who have contributed substantially to this work, in particular Sheldon Durkach and Chris Kirby, who are unable to participate, but hopefully in the future will join in. And we're happy to have some trainees that have been part of this. One of those is just getting started in this field and is in the room, Siobhan Reed. And this fits within one of the priorities of the Faculty of Health Sciences, the Rady faculty, through an innovation grant, which was titled Artificial Intelligence in Health, a Multidisciplinary Research Team, where we took our team and we're trying to grow that and extend the number of individuals who are interested in developing skills in the area of machine learning. And so one of the aims of this grant is to promote machine learning collaborations within and beyond the Faculty of Health Sciences. So my journey, because for those of you that don't know, I actually started off undergrad and postgrad in computer science, goes back to a natural language processing course I did in 1976. It was pretty crude type stuff, but I still have my library, or part of my library of books, and you can see what kinds of things we were reading and doing in the late 70s and early 80s. You had the building expert systems, everything was Lisp based pretty much, both as software and Lisp machines. Basically a lot of this was around expert systems in medical diagnosis and care, but it had broader applications as well. I'm going to mention the American Association of Artificial Intelligence briefly. I don't have this any longer. This is the syllabus from the 1984 meeting, which was held at the University of Austin in Texas, but I attended it. And you can see that my experience with AI ran from about 1976 to 1985. And partly that was driven by the AI winter, which is a term that was coined in 1984 at the AAAI meeting at the University of Austin in Texas. And it reflected one of the boom and bust cycles in AI, like the .com boom and bust. AI has been through a few of these. We're into the third boom phase right now. The first boom and bust was in the 60s and early 70s. That predates me. Good old-fashioned AI, the belief that once you write a checkers program, the next step is innate intelligence and computers take over the world. Well, we have checkers programs and humans are still in control, so that didn't quite work out. Expert systems, use of capturing knowledge from experts into rule-based or production rule systems, that was really, really hot when I was interested in the AI area. But after a few attempts, it didn't really grow much beyond these very specific niche areas. And so you can see the knowledge engineering, Mycin, which was for antibiotic prescription, Lisp and Prolog, programming logic and Lisp. I use all of those things, and they were all based upon very standard procedural type programming techniques. But the second winter hit, AI went underground, and I went back to school and started nuclear medicine and got on with my medical career. But in the background, machine learning was percolating and obviously has really grown in the last 1 to 2 decades, thanks, and this is the spring thaw of the winter, to the work of Jeff Hinton, currently in Toronto, and has been a huge contributor to this area. So he labored through the long winter and helped usher in the spring. And then the popularization, I mean, in the sense that making it accessible to the masses, a variety of tools, programming tools, and the processing tools, the computational tools that make the current approaches to machine learning feasible on the current programming platforms, available large data sources, and the programming tools to bring all that together. I started to take notice when JAMA started to take notice around 2017, so about 3 decades out of date, to papers in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, which is very high impact in the medical field, where they identified that deep learning algorithms were highly successful at identifying cancer that had spread from the breast into the lymph nodes in the armpit area, and that they could also use deep learning methods to identify the complications from diabetes that affect the eyes. I won't take you through all of these, but just to point out that there were Kaggle competitions. For those of you that are familiar with this, I know these bring together people that train and test machine learning algorithms off of publicly available data sets. And there's bragging rights to get the best algorithm, and also money that's involved in getting the best algorithm. And so what's better to identify a good algorithm to identify cancer spread in breast cancer than to have teams compete? So they actually had a competition, 23 teams, 32 algorithms. The best performers were achieving area under the curve AUC measures of upwards of 99% for this, which is phenomenal. And in fact, compared to medically trained experts, pathologists working in standard working conditions, the algorithms outperformed the medical experts, expert pathologists. So, you know, the medical field really sat up and took notice at this point. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I'm doing osteoporosis work. And just for those people that are not osteoporosis researchers, I'll tell you osteoporosis is a condition of low bone mass, low bone density, deterioration in bones that leads to an increase in risk for bones breaking, or so-called fractures. And some of those are very, very serious fractures, broken hips that kill about a quarter of people, fractures that can limit people's lifespan and their functional capacity. And there are pictures of normal bone on the left side, very dense, well-connected, and osteoporotic bone on the right side, very skimpy, very poorly connected. And you could imagine if you were a structural engineer that the engineering characteristics of this would be favorable. The engineering characteristics of this would be very poor. And so this is a structure that's very failure prone, fracture prone. We diagnose osteoporosis using a machine called a bone density machine, and or DXA for short, dual energy X-ray absorptiometer. And there's a picture of the machine that we currently use in Manitoba at our multiple testing sites, Brandon and Winnipeg. And typically we do measurements of density in the lumbar spine, the hip, and the forearm. These are the standard clinical sites. But since 2010 in Manitoba, we've also been doing something new, and we're the only province that actually is approved to do this. We can actually do pictures of the spine. So we lay the patient down on their side, on the scanning table, and we can do a sideways picture from basically the bottom of their neck all the way through their chest down to their pelvis. And we can look at the spine because we're looking for fractures that have already occurred. Fractures that have occurred in the spine, of course, already says this is weak bone. And so this person has osteoporosis, and this is somebody actually we want to treat. And this technique is called vertebral fracture assessment, or VFA for short, and I'll be using that term repeatedly. Why is this important? Well, fractures are common, osteoporosis is common, and so the numbers of fractures every year in Canada exceeds the numbers of heart attack, strokes, and new cases of breast cancer. So it has a large implication for the population at large, and some of these fractures, as I said, kill. About a quarter of hip fractures will kill the individuals in the first 6 to 12 months. The largest number of fractures are actually vertebral or spine fractures. And that's important because most vertebral or spine fractures you would think would be extremely painful, but the reality is they're not. Only a third or sometimes a sixth of the vertebral fractures that you can find on an X-ray have actually been painful enough for people to go and get them diagnosed. Anybody who's ever broken anything, and if I was to ask in the room, most people probably put their hands up. Say you fall and you break something in your wrist or your hand or your ankle, you know it instantly. Hurts like hell. Vertebral fractures are an exception to the rule. They're usually not that painful, although, of course, there are exceptions. The importance is that they identify somebody that's already got osteoporosis, because fractures don't occur in the spine. You don't collapse the vertebral body without a good reason. And if you didn't fall off a mountain or get hit by a truck, if it just collapsed on its own, that's weak bone. So that person automatically is considered under the current treatment guidelines to be high risk, or if we can identify the fractures on imaging, x-rays or these VFA scans, then that's high risk. And we want to treat those people because we have drugs that can reduce their risk for another fracture in the future. Now, you'd think that it would be easy to diagnose these, but it actually is not, and I'll show you why. First off, they're not painful, and so most of the fractures that occur in the population don't get diagnosed until you do an x-ray. This is a picture of a severe fracture. I think everyone here can see this one looks very different from its neighbors. So this is a severely collapsed vertebral fracture. But if you look back, you see this same person had had a previous CT scan. You can see it there. They'd had a previous chest x-ray. You can see it there. This fracture had actually been present for many, many years. Nobody had diagnosed it off the previous imaging because they were doing the CT and the chest x-ray for other reasons. So the opportunity to make the diagnosis, the opportunity to treat, to prevent further fractures was lost. And this person went on and had more fractures before they were actually diagnosed and treated. And so when I show you a picture like this and show you a normal spine, a normal VFA on the left side, you can see all these vertebral bodies look pretty much similar in size and shape to their neighbors. A little bit of the usual S shape to the spine. And if I show you the red arrow marks the spot, collapsed, collapsed, collapsed. These are all collapsed vertebral bodies. You say, gee, that doesn't look that hard. Why do we need machines to help us on this? Well, the reality is that those severe fractures are outnumbered by the number of milder fractures. And so if I was to have started off with this example on the right and said, is this a fracture or not? The answer is yes, it is. There's a buckle in the top of this vertebral body, but it's a lot milder. It's a lot more subtle. And some of you may not even believe that there's a fracture there, but trust me, I'm a doctor. Also, there are a lot of things that look like irregularities in those vertebral bodies that are not fractures. So these are examples, all these little indentations here on this spine, that's all normal. That's a congenital deformity, occurs in several percent of the population. Few people have congenital problems that make the body look extremely small. And this person was said to have a severe vertebral fracture. It's not. This is a congenital anomaly called a butterfly vertebra. And sometimes there are little areas where disc space, like a herniated disc, go into the vertebral body and produce big holes in the vertebral body. That's not a fracture. That's a Schmorl's node. There are a lot of other things that can make diagnosis more difficult, as I show you. So we have a perfect storm here in vertebral fracture diagnosis. They're important to recognize because, as I showed you, these diagnosis, you should be treating these people for osteoporosis because they got the diagnosis. But they don't cause many symptoms, and the imaging is not all that straightforward. There are false negatives. People have these on x-rays, but they're not diagnosed because people aren't looking for them. Or false positives, people say it looks like a fracture, but it actually is a normal variation. The experts disagree massively in what is and isn't a vertebral fracture, up to threefold. Two world-renowned experts, one is in Canada, one is in San Francisco. They differ by a factor of 3 in terms of how many vertebral fractures they can see on the same set of x-rays. So experts tend to cancel each other out. Thanks to Brian Lentil for this one. One expert plus one expert equals 0. So my journey resumes in 2017 in the machine learning area, thanks to a chance encounter with Mike Davidson, who's my consultant radiologist. And we look at these x-rays for vertebral fractures. And a lot of them are falsely described as fractures. And we look at them and say, you know what, that's really not a fracture, and get the information back to the family doctor so they don't put a person on drugs that they don't need. But when I was speaking with Doug, he said, you know what? We've got a smart new guy who's just joined our radiology group, a neuroradiologist, Sheldon Durkach. He's interested in machine learning. He's from Toronto. He's heard Jeff Hinton speak. Do we have a project that he might be interested in? And of course, I thought of the vertebral fracture project. I thought, gee, that's going to be a hard one. I don't think machines can do that. That's my skeptic side coming out. But, you know, vertebral fracture diagnosis, can computers do better? Well, I guess to start off, they can't do much worse than the status quo. So Starting with a few phone calls and emails, in August, the team starts to take shape. I give you the names at the beginning. By November, the group is very active, especially Sheldon and Chris are emailing and posting the results on a Slack channel that Doug created daily, and I will tell you, nightly. So they were working almost 24/7 on this. We were getting advice from contacts that Doug had on how to develop and optimize our method, and so I came up with this heuristic for the strategy that we used based upon all the experts. Try something. If it doesn't work, try something else. Because it turns out there's no clear pathway to coming up with an optimal algorithm. But we did try stuff, and we tried various things, and lo and behold, it started to come together, it started to work, and by September of 2018, we were actually able to present very favorable results at the American Society of Bone Mineral Research, and that's what I'll be sharing with you today.
The other thing that we got from that was, yeah, good luck with that. They said you're looking for a needle in a haystack, because a lot of the deep learning work had been on images where things were very clear. They weren't grainy images. You're looking for a dog or a cat. So that was the other advice that came with it, is try whatever you want. Your odds aren't good. So
yeah, our images are very noisy, and I'll show you a little bit more of that, so you get a sense as to what we're up against.
What's a Slack channel?
A Slack's just a way for interacting. People can all just post comments into a growing comment area.
Options like Dropbox and
No, Slack is slick. I'm going to tell you, Slack is slick, and
it's better than email in that when you send something out, you don't have to decide who you're sending it to. You just put it on the channel. Anyone who's interested can look. It's all there for posterity. You don't have to file things into different boxes in your mail system.
You can post different documents and images and links
large
and.
teams are interacting that way by and large. Email's dying quick for a lot of project.
So you can put code snippets up and links to other things. It's really very efficient. If you have if you want to go back, it's searchable, so you can go back and see how you got to a certain place very quickly. So I'm sold on this. I use this for Osteoporosis Canada collaborations now. So here's our DXA machine. Just to remind you again, this is where we're coming. How we do our vertebral fracture assessments, and with that, we actually have in Manitoba a repository of all scans that have been done in Manitoba since 1990. So this is a large repository, largest in the world of its kind. It's linkable with outcomes, and so we actually have created anonymized versions of all these scan files in different formats, including MATLAB, so that these are available for outside of the vendor-specific imaging format for research work. Now, if it was isolated, it wouldn't be all that powerful, but once it can be linked to other Manitoba data, medical claims for medical diagnoses, hospital admissions, drug use, vital statistics for death, through anonymized personal health information numbers, then this becomes very powerful, because now we can study outcomes directly from these data. And this is where I've been working for the last decade, working in the coal mine. Alan's here to keep me honest. You need permissions. So here's one of my favorite slides. From up here, you can see 5 different layers of government. That's almost as many permission layers as you need to do this. It's actually getting a lot slicker. But I have had projects that have needed more than 5 layers of permission. As I said before, we've been using vertebral fracture assessment in Manitoba since 2010. We're the only province that actually has official reimbursement to do this. We have criteria that we developed with Manitoba Health for who qualifies for this. I won't bore you with all this. Basically, about a quarter of individuals qualify for a vertebral fracture assessment based upon a certain level of bone density, their age, or risk factors that put them at higher risk for having and finding a vertebral fracture. We don't want to test young, healthy people, but that's a needle in a haystack. And so we want to have a reasonable in return on who we're testing. But about a quarter to a fifth of individuals qualify for this. And we've published our results on this showing that when we identify a vertebral fracture on this, we can predict hard outcomes, risk for hip fracture, risk for other fractures, and that this makes a huge difference on treatment. We can double the treatment initiation in the right people as a result of doing a vertebral fracture assessment. We've published all those data in the last few months.
Maybe then the outcomes of treatment?
We know from clinical trials that the drugs work. So we can't do it directly at this stage, but the implication is, yeah, this is actually going to be helpful to individuals. It's very hard to believe that it wouldn't be. Now, what do we have to train on? Well, we've got this repository of VFA scans, about 15,000 available at the time that we did our work. What kind of labeling do we have? The labeling is very crude. It's what we use because this was set up for clinical purposes. We report to the family doctor there's a fracture or there isn't a fracture. And in a small number of cases, we don't know. We've looked at everything, we've consulted with experts, we're still not sure. So yes, no, maybe. That's all we got. We don't say where the fracture is, we don't say what level in the spine, we don't say how severe it is. The label is very, very weak to train a complex, based upon complex imaging. But we soldiered on regardless. And this is the data. This is the data that is actually impressed with radiology. So I don't think it's embargoed. We have presented this at an international meeting, but we won't post please don't share this link quite yet. But we started off for this analysis with about 13,000 vertebral fracture scans in individual patients. We excluded a certain number based predominantly because we weren't sure whether there was a fracture or not. So about 400 were of the 13,000 that was possible, it's a maybe. And that left us with just under 13,000 for the training. Some were incomplete, were excluded. And they were assigned into a training data set, a validation data set, and then 30% were reserved for a test data set. And of course, all of the evaluation on performance of the algorithm has to be on that clean test data set. Numbers are not bad. It's not millions and millions of cats and dogs, as you can get off Google, but in the imaging area, 13,000 scans is a respectable number. I've seen some machine learning publications with a couple hundred, and you know that that can't be right. Unique to our study as well is we actually had linked outcomes to see who actually has fractures and who doesn't fractures. Does the finding of a vertebral fracture predict what we wanted to predict, that is, a future outcome? And so we could evaluate that in about 2,800 of these individuals. Now I'm going to highlight in this box the fact that we had to exclude the individuals with possible or uncertain vertebral fractures, because one of the learnings of this experience was that was really, really critical. At an initial attempt to train where we took the uncertains or the possibles and left them in with no fracture, the algorithm wouldn't train. So that small number was sufficient to interfere with training. So we had to have clean labels, yes, no, and get rid of the uncertains to get.
Could you put those back into this?
We've been thinking about that, and I think I did try it out. The numbers weren't big enough to be intelligible, but with a larger number of uncertains, maybe, yeah, that's already occurred to us.
What fraction of the scans are labeled fracture?
I haven't said, but it's 16%.
16.
Yeah. So it's an unbalanced data set, no question, but it's a reasonable number of positives to train off of. Yeah, if it was 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000, then you'd have a problem. We'll come back to that at the end when I talk about some of the transfer learning challenges we've had. So I've talked to you about this. So just to let you know what the algorithm has to contend with. Well, we have stuff on patients that's just in the way. It's just stray noise. So these are bra clips on the back. These are bra clips with underwire, mesh in the abdomen. These are stuff that are on patients, big necklace in the top. You have to learn how to ignore all that kind of stuff. We have stuff that's inside of patients. So these are screws and things that orthopods, orthopedic surgeons have implanted in patients. So you can see these make very, very noisy images. We didn't exclude them. We left them in because you can see, even though this looks like an ugly, ugly scan, look at all this, all the metal there. Wait a second. There's a vertebral fracture there. So just because there's junk in the spine doesn't mean you can't use it to identify fracture. So this is a true positive case. Sometimes there are things that cast shadows, and there are artifacts that aren't even in the textbooks that we saw that degrade the scan quality. So in real life, the nice examples I showed you at the beginning are almost equal in number to the numbers of scans that are ugly. So this is problematic. We also have two different generations of scanners to contend with. The first generation scanner had a much lower resolution than the second generation scanner. We have more of these, first generation and second generation, but you can see if you're trying to train an algorithm, you're trying to train it upon two different sets of image quality. This is you can see the pixel characteristics here, 400 by 167, fourfold greater with the second scanner. And so to bring into some sort of a level playing field, we rescaled all of these to sort of the midpoint of 600 by 360, somewhat arbitrary, but that was the idea to resample these so that they're on the same pixel basis for training. We didn't want to train a separate algorithm for one scanner type and another scanner type. We want to do it all together.
How do you do that? If you haven't got the sensitivity in the first one, how do you upgrade it?
Well, it's interpolated. So yeah, so I'll show you a little bit more about that towards the end. And so you can see that you do have problems with image resolution. So these are two scans, two different patients, the old scanner, the new scanner. You can see this fracture mild. I think everyone here can see that there's a difference as you go down until you get this crunched one with a little indentation to this vertebral body. I could sell you this is a fracture a lot more easily, I think, than I could sell you that there's a fracture here. I'm not even sure I believe it myself, but I think we probably called it a true positive. So that's a challenge for the algorithm. So what was the architecture? I'm not going to go through a lot of detail on the technical stuff. This is going to be dealt with in future talks. But after a number of exploratory things, we settled on two different architectures. One has had almost 600 layers, and one was 44 layers. Inception ResNet v2 and DenseNet, you can see the number of parameters that are fitted together, just shy of 60 million parameters, which is typical of machine learning nowadays. Of course, it blows all the rules to hell in terms of overfitting of classical statistical models. Details on training, watch this space. I'm going to hand this off to Doug in a future talk probably, or one of the others. But this is where we get to. This is the performance in the independent 30% test set. The classification against the human as the gold standard, as I said, experts disagree, so our humans are no better than the experts. So our gold standard is not gold, it's just our reference standard. But you can see that the DenseNet algorithm, the Inception algorithm gave AUCs of about 0.93. So that's pretty darn good when I show you the challenges that we had. We used the maximum output of those two to ensemble this and got a 1% gain up to 0.94. Turned out it didn't matter whether you used maximum, minimum, or mean. I tried both and they all gave the same results. For those of you that are familiar with concordance through a kappa, we looked at that as well. And this, because it's an unbalanced data set, it has to be adjusted for prevalence and variance. So PABIC was 0.77, which is not perfect, but it's pretty good. And And I'll show you that we actually had 2 human experts independently look at a lot of these cases. And some of these cases were easy cases because the human original reader and the computer agreed. And some of these were hard cases because the computer and the human reader disagreed. And so if we look at the kappa between 2 additional independent blinded human readers, their kappa for the easy cases was 0.76, so identical to what the machine gave with our reference standard. And for hard cases, they had a kappa of 0.52. So this is not easy, even for human experts in this field. This is a busy slide, but it just shows that when we broke this out by sensitivity, specificity, according to age, sex, whether people were obese or non-obese, and the generation of scanner, it really didn't matter. We got the same performance across the board. Sensitivity, specificity, accuracies, all in the high 80%, so AUC 0.94. And again, remember, we had those 2 very different imaging characteristics, pixel dimensions. You would think that that might have screwed up the algorithm. As it turns out, it didn't. We got identical AUCs, no significant difference. So one algorithm, it turns out, performed equally well on 2 quite different set of imaging characteristics. Now, the acid test is what are we trying to predict? We're trying to predict something or find something on the VFA scan that will predict a clinically relevant outcome. Finding something that's asymptomatic in the spine is only a step on the pathway to identifying people that are high risk for developing hip fractures and other bad fractures. And remember that we actually can do this kind of linkage study. And so I won't take you through the algorithms, but we validated algorithms where we can do that with Manitoba Health data. Mean observation in this is 3.7 years. Remember, we only started in 2010. And so this is intermediate term follow-up. And this looks at the prediction of a non-vertebral fracture diagnosis into the future. And these are Kaplan-Meier curves. So you start off with nobody who's had a non-vertebral fracture, and over time, this is your fracture-free survival fraction. As fractures occur, the fracture-free survival goes down. And you can see that there are 2 sets of lines here, in black and in gray. This reflects whether the CNN predicted a fracture, yes, no, and whether the human predicted a fracture, yes, no. And so if the human and the CNN both said no fracture, you can see that the cumulative rate of non-vertebral fracture is identical. If the human and the CNN independently identify a fracture on the VFA scan, the chance of a non-vertebral fracture occurring is significantly greater. And again, the curves are virtually superimposable over time. So you get the same prediction of non-vertebral fracture outcomes into the future from a human and the CNN. I say non-vertebral fracture because we don't want to diagnose the same vertebral fracture that we saw on the scan into the future. So we're going to get rid of those because they just cause problems. Now, I told you before that the hip fracture is the one that's expensive, the one that kills. How do we do for predicting hip fractures? The answer is exactly the same. We see the same similar performance for separation of no fracture on VFA versus fracture present on VFA for human and CNN. So it works. It can predict, it can identify things in the spine that are predictive of the outcome that we want to be able to identify. We also did some Cox regression to adjust for baseline fracture characteristics and treatment. The bottom line is it didn't make a heck of a lot of difference. The hazard ratio, or think of this as a relative risk if you prefer, for a CNN versus the human reader finding the presence versus absence of a vertebral fracture on the VFA was the same, about a 1.7 to 1.8-fold increase in the risk for a future non-vertebral fracture and over a 2-fold increase in the risk for a future hip fracture. So very strongly predictive of future outcomes. And that's despite advantage human in tennis parlance. We're all talking tennis these days, right? Thanks to Bianca. Advantage human because the humans here had access to previous CT scans and x-rays and the clinical information. The computer had none of that. The human also had the opportunity to say uncertain, which we excluded from the analysis. The humans could plead the fifth. The computer can't. It had to give a yes, no on every case. Localization is hot in this area. Can you see, because we don't know from a yes, no, what is the algorithm actually responding to? Is it actually responding to the fracture or something else in the image that could be contributing to the outcome? And so we used GradCam to generate heat maps, which are images that show pixel-wise where the areas that are contributing the greatest to the output from the network. And this is an example of one of these, overlaying the colorized heat map on top of the VFA image. You can see there's a vertebral fracture here, and that's where the heat's coming from on this on the scan. So there's some plausibility that the algorithm is actually, quote, seeing, quote, fracture. If there are multiple fractures, again, we saw multiple areas of localization. We haven't systematically examined this, but just as examples, what we're identifying. Now, I think I have time to talk a little bit about the next phase of the project, which is work that a BSc Med student recently completed working with us on transfer learning. And this is Stephen Reda's work. I'll give him full props on this, and he was supervised by Sheldon Durkach and on this predominantly. I know that VCRs are gone the way to the dodo, but people remember here VHS versus beta. A few old timers do. Two VCR formats that were in constant competition. Beta was better, but it died. VHS survived. Exactly. Thank you for that. Thanks. We have the same thing in the bone density field. We have VHS and beta. Half of the world uses GE scanners. The other half of the world uses hologic scanners. And they have different characteristics in how they generate their images. So even though both of these are vertebral fracture assessment scans, they both look for vertebral fractures, they do it by very different techniques. This uses a single energy of photon or X-ray. This uses a dual or two different levels of energy. And at first glance, you might say, well, these look similar. I see vertebral bodies in both of them, and that's a true statement. But what you don't see here, that you see on this side, is this black stuff up here, which is the lungs. And so because this is a single energy, it looks a lot like a regular X-ray. You see lungs and diaphragms and bowel gas and all this kind of stuff, which gets subtracted out in these. So they're actually generated by slightly different ways. And the question we had is, can you take the algorithm that was trained on this, which would be applicable to half the world, and apply it to these kinds of scans, which would then cover the other half of the world? That would be really nice. And it makes sense that you're looking for the same characteristics in these. The reality is when we tried this, we got failed. Didn't work.
So GE are going to be able to pay you a lot of money.
Yeah, like they paid, yeah.
Right? To confirm that your thing works in GE, so everybody should now buy GE.
That's it.
Good
You can manage my portfolio
thank you.
on this.
That's not a good idea.
So fortunately, we have the ability with the GE scans, even though our standard is to use dual energy, we actually can pull out the single energy off them. So we can generate from this dual energy GE scan a single energy GE scan, and use this maybe as a bridge to the single energy hologic scan. At least that was the plan for the project that Stephen was working on. So you can see these are identical scans, these two, the middle and the left, just slightly different imaging characteristics. But otherwise, if you look in the detail, they're otherwise identical. We need a training set of these hologic scans. And so my collaborator Didier Hans in Switzerland obliged and sent us almost 3,000 hologic scans that were labeled. 135 were labeled as fractures and about 2,500 labeled as no fractures. We got rid of the ones that were questionable non-fracture deformities, which were coded in the algorithm. Now we're getting into a problem because now we're down to 135 with fractures. So now the numbers are getting small. We split this up into training validation test and did a final test in a 30% sub test set. And to start off, and this was our benchmark, what we were heading for, don't nod yet, Alan, it gets worse. If we took the GE single energy and did our standard 70%, 30% split and evaluated scratch trained on the GE single energy to see how it performed on single energy test set, we got an AUC that about 0.91, a little less than the 0.94, but you know, still very respectable. When we take the hologic data sets from a Lausanne and scratch train that, we got an AUC of 0.54, which ain't so good. It's better than chance, barely. We then took the GE scratch trained on single energy and then applied that to the hologic data set. And now we're getting up to 0.62 as an AUC. So it's better, but you can't sell this. But then we took the scratch change GE and used that to fine tune off the hologic training data set. So you now are using the two in combination to improve performance. And now we're up to 0.744. And so now it's you're sitting forward saying, what's the next one going to show? And the answer is, we don't have any more. That was as good as it got. And I think we ran out of runway here because we only had, when we did the split between training and evaluation, 97 fractures that we could actually train on with the hologic data set. If we'd had 1,000 fractures to train on the hologic data set, I think we would have continued to bump it up and get back to where we were before, but we need more. Can we get more cowbell? That's what we need. We need more cowbell here. And I think we can, because we've just received the hologic VFA scans from the Canadian Longitudinal Study on Aging, 28,000 VFA scans. That's the good news. The bad news is that none of these have labels. That's our job. We're supposed to apply, but generate the labels. And so I haven't thought about this, but I'm thinking that maybe we could actually use the algorithm that we've got to this point, apply it to 2,000 or 3,000 of the unlabeled CLSA scans, pull out from those likely and unlikely vertebral fractures, and then manually review a subset of that and probably get a large number of true positives, true negatives to extend the training that we've already got. Because we're up to 0.744. I think we can keep going if we have a larger number. Can we generalize this beyond DXA? And these are an X-ray, this is a CT scan, this is an MR, maybe. Sheldon ran this on some images. And so maybe once the machine can identify vertebral fractures on GE and hologic VFA scans, we can extrapolate that to other imaging. That's a long ways away. Where's the competition in this field? Well, there's a group called Zebra that's building its market around AI technologies in imaging, and they actually have already developed and marketing a program to identify compression fractures not on DXA scans but on VFA. It's a deterministic algorithm. They segment the spine first to identify what they call the sagittal patch extracted along the vertebral column, basically focusing on individual vertebral levels. They have a CNN they apply to the patches. This is an 8-layer, very, very simple algorithm. And there you can see here, they scaled these patches down to 32 by 32 pixel sizes. And when you look at these sample images, these are grainy, ugly things. Then they have a final layer, which is basically a recurrent neural net to classify the level. And their performance, it's almost as identical to ours. Even though CTs are better quality scans, don't have as much noise as what we're dealing with, they're getting about 90% performance. So next steps, I'll winding up here. Clearly, machine learning is back. Is it here to stay? I guess the future will predict. I think so. I think that the performance here is clearly much more substantial and seems to be more generalizable than anything we've seen up to this point. So I've gone from skeptic to convert in my journey. And at future presentations, we hope to be able to look at some coding details and run some of these on site to show you some of the training. I want to do more training around outcomes using the larger sets of DXA scans that we have, where we have 150,000 spine and hip scans. Training for cardiovascular outcomes based upon abdominal aortic calcium scoring. That's what Siobhan is contributing to. And of course, enhancing opportunities for collaboration with others. So if you're interested in this, send me an email, send Lisa an email. We want to get you engaged. We want you to present. Or lead a journal club, or do something. We just want this group to grow. And so thank you for joining in, and happy for discussion.
I have a question, Bill. This is great stuff. The question is about advantage human. Have you thought about bringing in all of the administrative data to get that advantage about the context of the patient and the impact of that on your ability? So this is all about reading images, which I think machine learning AI has really, it's been a game changer in terms of the capacity, the abilities, and it's been used been proposed in multiple environments. But for me, bringing in the other data is what's my area of interest, is combining the two. Have you thought of trying to do that, and is that feasible with what you've got?
So maybe I'm not fully understanding the question, or maybe the question can go in many directions. So a couple of things that we tried early on was, the training that we've done here is based purely off the image data.
Okay.
And so we did ask the question, would we get a better performance if we use some of the clinical information, if the algorithm knew the patient's age, if they knew their sex, knew their bone density, knew some of their history. And so
we showed us the table.
But those weren't inputs. Those are just based on characteristics. So we actually did do that at one stage, and modified the inception algorithm, I think it was, to take inputs from those to see if that would improve training. It didn't actually seem to be beneficial in terms of just looking at the image data itself. I was always concerned, maybe I was overly concerned, about whether or not the VFA images, which off the GE actually encode bone density. So the way these come off the scanner, bone density is encoded into this. Is that information that the algorithm should know, or is that cheating? Should it not know what the density is in the spine? If you want to optimize the performance, give it all the information you can. But if you're trying to see is it actually identifying the fracture, maybe it's getting the right answer for the wrong reason. As it turns out, we normalized these anyway, so we took that away. And when we gave it that additional information on density, it didn't seem to improve the performance. So that's one side of the question. The other question is that using administrative data for training purposes, we are working on that. Mark Bryanton, who's joined in the group here, I think, interested in using that. Can we take fracture risk prediction algorithms like the FRAX tool, which is based upon conventional statistical modeling, and can you get an improvement in performance, a lift in performance, if you use machine learning to learn off of the same inputs to FRAX than just modeling them as they've historically been done? And that's been demonstrated in, I'm part of a genomics project with the UK Biobank, and using a polygenic score for osteoporosis, they showed that you could get about a 5% gain in classification off of GWAS data using machine learning compared with traditional methods. So yeah, maybe there's lots of opportunities for this. This is why it's so important to create a framework for being able to link clinical data and admin data so that researchers have access to this in a secure environment. And of course, that's what we're working on with you.
To your multi-letter acronym there, you really don't know until you try. In all these things, just the amount of data you've got, the kind of it, the covariates we looked at, there might be other things in administrative data that actually do contribute. So that's kind of the fun in this, is just load up all these different kinds of things, see what happens.
So can I ask, the end goal must be then to take people out, or again, at some point somebody's gonna do the scan, the machine will probably run out this fracture, and I guess, are you comfortable with that point at that point now, or are you still working on it to get it that way?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not sure if people can hear that. It's Dan Chateau from the back of the room saying, is the end game that the computers will do these completely without human supervision, and am I comfortable with that? And he's being somewhat provocative and laughing here, but no, that's not the end game. I think the idea is to use this as we use other tools in the diagnostic imaging field that are computer-based, as an independent set of eyes to draw attention to things, to standardize between humans. I think that where you might be closer to this is if we look at this zebra tool. And so the zebra tool, the idea here is that this actually integrates into a PACS environment. And this will monitor CT scans that are anonymized and shipped over to this group, and will be identifying vertebral fractures off of CT scans that are not being done to look for vertebral fractures. And so that in real time, or not quite real time, but will identify vertebral fractures that were missed because they weren't being looked for by the radiologist, and that it once a day, the facility that signed up with Zebra gets a posting of all the vertebral fractures that were identified on the CT scans that day, so they can go back and review them and follow up on them. So yeah, it's leveraging existing data to get more and to do better.
From an engineering perspective, it's part of the story that in the States now they reimburse for these scans. You've got DXA scanners all over the place with people that really have very little background on how to interpret the images.
Yeah, Doug's absolutely right. I didn't give this background, but in the States, it's in its heyday. Bone density testing was extremely well paid in the States. So every Tom, Dick, and Harry would buy a DXA scanner and put it in their in the clinic next to the 7-Eleven, and they would do these things. Family docs would say, "I'll report out the bone densities. I'll report out the vertebral fractures off the VFA because it's well reimbursed." If the experts are having a challenge with this, and I can tell you, as an area, someone who's been in this the imaging field for 30 years, I found vertebral fracture assessment, the VFA scans, maybe the hardest thing that I've encountered in terms of scan rating. If it's that hard for somebody after 30 years of experience in imaging, what's a family doc doing?
What about the profession? Somebody with less experience.
Thank you so much. Somebody absolutely right. And there are some very committed, very good family docs doing some excellent DXA work. So I have been appropriately upbraided. But you can see that having some expertise on board here could be very helpful in the wider community.
Okay.